I don't know if you've heard or not, but there's actually an airborne contagion that's kind of sparking all kinds of fear as rumors of the coronavirus are rising. I was talking with a lady, a friend of mine this week, and she told me she was certain that it was going to be an epidemic here in the United States, and she was telling me that I need to go shopping and stock up my pantry, and I need to begin to build in my isolation plan, so she told me we need to start having church online so that we're not intermingled with each other and all of those things. I'm not smart enough to warn you as to whether or not the coronavirus is going to take over, but I am observant enough to warn you of another airborne contaminant that's easily passed from person to person, and it does great damage, and it threatens disaster, and this virus is called hurry. And you can't avoid it with a mask and hand sanitizer. And it's so stinking easy to spot. I challenge you this week, just begin to look for all the people around you who are in a hurry. They're everywhere. They're in this room right now. And if you wonder whether or not maybe you've caught that hurry bug, let me read you some of the symptoms of hurry from John Mark Comer's book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Irritability, hypersensitivity, restlessness, workaholism, or maybe just nonstop activity, emotional numbness, out of order priorities, lack of care for your body, escapist behaviors, slippage of spiritual disciplines, or isolation. Or I think one of the most telling signs of hurry in my own heart is anxiety. And last week we talked about how as a human race we're sleeping less and less, right? We're down to 7.5 hours on average. And part of me wonders if part of that reason we're not sleeping so well is because we are anxious, and it's hard to turn our thoughts off long enough to fall asleep. In 2018, the American Psychiatric Association surveyed 1,000 adults in the United States, and they simply asked them, are they more anxious today than they were a year ago? 39% of them said yes. This is troubling. We have to turn the hurry down. Here's why hurry makes us sick. This is my theory. Because we were created to have a healthy dependence on limits. No matter who the motivational speaker is, or no matter what your high school counselor told you, no matter what your grandma says to you, you aren't able to achieve anything if you would just put your mind and soul to it. I don't think that's true. The truth is we all have limits. And here's the thing. Those limits don't have to be negatives. It is these limits that afford us the grace of God. Have you ever thought about it? The very limits in your life may be the avenue through which God's grace will come to you. If we will just embrace the limits instead of racing past them and pushing through them, we may find exactly what we need. I can't help but think of Adam and Eve in the garden, right? They're the first people to inhabit the earth, and they're given this job, and they're turned loose, and everything is theirs to enjoy, and everything is theirs to work, except God does this really weird thing, right? He puts a limit on them. And He says there's this one tree that you need to stay away from. In other words, God understood that there was real value in giving us a limitation. But then comes the serpent, the slithery one, the snake, the deceiver. And what does the deceiver do? The deceiver tries to convince Adam and Eve that surely a God who loves you and wants what's best for you wouldn't put limits in your life. That's not love. He's holding back on you. You can't trust Him. If He loved you, there would be no limits to what you could do. And what do Adam and Eve do? They buy the lie of the serpent. Because he convinces them that the limit is holding them back from the richest life possible. He presses in on them until they believe that God must be holding out. And they take the fall. And before we just kind of shame on them, let's admit to ourselves, we love pushing limits, right? If not, just remember to when you were 16 or 17. We love pushing limits, right? We do. There's something about it. But it's amazing the collateral damage that comes when we push or ignore our limits. As you know, if you were with us for our Ash Wednesday service, this year for Lent, I'm fasting something a little bit different than I ever have before. I'm actually fasting hurry, which is kind of weird, right? That's who fasts from hurry? But I'm trying to fast from hurry. And so that means that I'm not saying hurry up to my kids, although I did catch myself this morning. I apologize. I'm walking a bit slower, and I'm driving the speed limit. I have to set my cruise control. I'll admit, I've been in a hurry for so long. If I don't set my cruise control, I'll go 5, 6, 7 miles per hour over. But I'm setting my cruise control. And here's the thing I noticed this week, is when I'm speeding, and this is a simple illustration, but it's powerful. When I'm speeding, there is other things that are happening simultaneously that are unhealthy. So when I'm speeding, I am constantly looking for police officers, because I don't want to get pulled over. And those of you who just laughed, you know the same thing. You're looking on the on-ramps and the off-ramps. You're looking at the parking lots. You're looking anywhere to see where the cops are. And so your mind is a little bit distracted. You know the other thing that happens when I'm speeding is I'm getting really annoyed with people who aren't speeding. Why aren't they in a hurry? Go. We've got places to go, right? Not to mention that just going at a higher rate of speed is more dangerous, so my wife tells me. Because this is the thing. When I am unwilling to live within limits, I make life harder, more arduous, more stressful, and as a result, I'm what I call hurry sick. But when I set my cruise control to 55 miles per hour on Highway 117 out here, I'm realizing that limits aren't a negative thing. I love what the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. He says, "Therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. And 3 times I pleaded with the Lord, 'Take it away from me.' But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong.'" In other words, Paul gets it, right? He was created with limits. And when he accepts the limitations he has been given, he won't ignore them. When he doesn't try to push through them, he finds a grace from God that is perfect for his every need. Isn't that interesting? The world needs to hear this, church, because the key to whether or not your life or my life amount to anything valuable is not based upon how well we can push through the limitations we feel. That is not the key. The key is that we see our limitations as the pores through which God's perfect grace enters our world. So let me ask you, are you ignoring your limits? Are you ignoring your limits? Are you just grabbing a bit more caffeine and popping a few more ibuprofen and taking some NyQuil to finally get some sleep? Are you staying late at the office more nights than you're home early? If so, you may be missing God's perfect grace made available when you respect the limits. Because we operate best as human beings when we have margin. When we have margin in our life. And margin is the space between our load and our limit. So imagine just for a second that you just bought a brand new computer and you brought it home. And the computer has 500 gigs of memory, has a 16 gigabyte RAM hard drive. You get it home, you pop it on the desk, and you turn it on, and you fire it up, and that thing just runs like a gazelle. It is so fast. It's just beautiful. You just love it. But then over time, over the years, you start to add pictures and videos, maybe video games and documents, and all kinds of things begin to add up in that available space. And all of a sudden, the load that you're putting on the computer is getting closer and closer to the limit it was created with. And pretty soon, you turn on your computer and it takes you 15 minutes to check an email because that little circle just spins and spins and spins. Why does it do that? Because there's no margin. There's no space between load, what's actually on it, what it's carrying, and its built-in limits. And we're not much different. Some of us are running around and we have no margin. We must figure out a way to turn the hurry down, to find the grace that Paul wrote about. And that's why I direct your attention today to Matthew 11, 28 through 30. And Jesus sees this spread of this nasty, contagious disease of hurry. Jesus recognizes it even in his day and age, a much slower world, and he offers this vaccine. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." And as we already heard, I love verse 29 from Eugene Peterson's perspective. Listen to these words. "Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythm of grace." Because here's the cool thing about Jesus. He doesn't give prescriptions for hurry. There's no shot in the arm. Hopefully there will be for the coronavirus. But for hurry, there's no prescription. Jesus instead, he offers to mentor you. He doesn't give you an instruction manual. He gives you a real-life how-to video. And isn't it interesting that Jesus rarely gives commands on the spiritual disciplines? Prayer is the exception, okay? I'll admit that. And that's a whole nother sermon. Jesus tells us how to pray. He tells us we should pray. He commands us to pray all the time. But he doesn't often command us into these other spiritual disciplines that bring this rhythm of life. Instead, what he does is he lives it out perfectly. That was God's intention. Instead of another instruction manual, what if Jesus comes to live out this rhythm perfectly? And then what does he say? He says, "Come, follow me. Take my yoke upon you. I will show you the remedy for your sickness." It's not "you shall," it's "follow me." So let's do it, church. What if we did? What if we follow him? What will we find? What is Jesus' response to the sickness of hurry? And first, I want to just tell you, I love that Jesus waited 30 years to preach his first sermon. Isn't that crazy? If anyone should have been fast-tracked for the ministry, if anyone should have been fast-tracked for a platform of influence, it was Jesus, wasn't it? He was the Messiah, born of a virgin. Kings and wise men came and recognized that he was this one he said he was, and yet for 30 years he waits because Jesus wasn't in a hurry. Isn't that interesting? He wasn't in a hurry. And then at the end of Matthew chapter 3, we hear of Jesus' ordination, if you will. He comes and he's baptized by John the Baptist, and he comes up out of the water, and there's an audible voice from heaven that breaks the skies, and this is what God the Father says. "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. This is his ordination moment. And I can almost imagine the people that are around hearing this and being in awe, and this is an emotional moment, and an awestruck moment, and they're probably saying, speech, 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 speech. Like, let's hear it. This is the Messiah. This is the chosen one. What do you have, Jesus? And the very next verse is this. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. The wilderness. That's where Jesus went after this ordination. He went to the desolate place, the solitary place. He went to the quiet place. He went to the silent place for 40 days. He hasn't even started ministry yet. And he's already headed towards solitude and silence. One day in, and he's headed to the wilderness. And I think we read this sometimes and we think, man, the devil has found the perfect place to tempt Jesus, right? He's fasting, he's hungry, he's alone. It's quiet, nobody's around, it's solitude. The devil has found him in the wilderness, and if ever Jesus was weak, it was now. If ever he was going to catch him in a mistake, it was now. But not so fast. Because this mindset reveals that we underappreciate the secret place. We underappreciate the silent place, the solitary place. And I would propose to you that Jesus wasn't in a weak moment here. This is the worst place for the devil to catch Jesus. Because he's just spent 40 days in silence and solitude with God the Father. He's not weak and weary. He may be hungry, but he knows where his strength comes from. He's rooted in silence. He embraced his limits. So Jesus, one day in, is in the wilderness for 40 days. And then if we jump to Mark's gospel starts in chapter 1, and it's kind of the first couple days of Jesus' ministry. Mark's gospel just starts right with his ministry. In this first chapter, it's frenetic and efficient. Jesus, he comes out of the desert and he calls his discipleship team. So he's organizing a team. And then he teaches in the synagogue and he amazes people. And then he drives out some impure spirits. And then he physically heals some people. What a day. He had to be exhausted. So now it's time to veg out, right? Now it's time to stream some shows on Netflix, to take a vacation, to have a day off. He's going to turn the alarm clock off. He's going to sleep in. This is a rough first day. We have all been there, right? That's what you do when you're beat up and tired. But Mark 1:35 says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, this is the day after all of this activity, Jesus got up, he left the house, and he went off to a solitary place, and he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him. When they found him, they exclaimed, everyone is looking for you. Jesus replied, let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. This is why I have come. And church, this is why Jesus wants us to follow him, because he knows that the remedy for the sickness of hurry has a lot to do with finding a silent and solitary place. You see, in my life and in your life, I would venture to say that when things begin to get hurried and frenetic, when the demands from people are high, when everyone around us is pressing in and looking for us and vying for our attention, the first thing to go in our lives is typically silence. The first thing to go in our life is the solitary place, is the quiet. The hurry just pushes it out. Yet Jesus says, if you really want to turn the hurry down, you have to follow me into some silence. Know your limits. Embrace them. Find the solitary place. I love Mark chapter 6 now. We're just a few chapters later. Now the disciples are doing supernatural works, and word is spreading about Jesus, and there's crowds gathering. And in Mark chapter 6, it says the disciples were run so ragged that they didn't have time to eat. Have you ever been there before? They were going so fast they didn't even have time to eat. That's what it says in chapter 6. So Jesus says this to them in Mark chapter 6. Come with me by yourself to a quiet place and get some rest. So they get on a boat and they try to get away, but guess what? The crowds chase them down. The crowds actually chase them down. And so Jesus has grace on them, and he teaches those crowds all day, and then they begin to get hungry. And you might remember the story. The disciples say they're gonna riot here if we don't send them away and feed them. But Jesus takes 5 loaves, and he feeds 5,000. All in this day where the disciples are run ragged and haven't eaten. And then Jesus finally sends the disciples away. It's nighttime now. It's time for some rest, right? He sends the disciples ahead, away from the crowd, and surely now Jesus finds a place where he can get some sleep. But in verse 46, it says, after leaving them, Jesus, he went up on a mountainside, a quiet place where nobody was, to pray. Because Jesus understood he had limits. And even Jesus knew that he couldn't hurry and help. So when he says to take my yoke, when he invites you to follow, what he's doing is he's inviting you to the silent place. He's inviting you to the solitary place, even if it costs you sleep, even if it costs you rest. Will we follow him to the silence? Even when Jesus should have been asleep, he chose silence and solitude in prayer. Here's the cool thing about Jesus. The busier he gets in the Gospels, you read them and watch, the more we see Jesus pulling away to the quiet place. So when was the last time you found the silent and solitary place? No, really. When was the last time you were silent in the presence of God? Silence in which you can actually make out the voice of God. You know, my contention is it's almost impossible. And you know why? Because we have the noisiest invention in all of human history in our front pockets or in our purse. It's right here. There's nothing noisier than this. This thing dings 100 times a day, wanting my attention. In a recent Microsoft survey, 77% of young adults answered yes when asked, when nothing is occupying my attention, the first thing I do is reach for my phone. 77%. So if our phones are nearby, if people are nearby, if our TVs are on, if the radio's going, our decibel levels are always so high that we can't make out the voice of God if we wanted to. He has to shout above all of the noise, because it's never quiet enough. So what if we pulled ourselves away from the noise? What if we did you know this thing has airplane mode? What if we put it on airplane mode? What if we actually got silent? Maybe then God would teach us our limits and give us courage to live within them. Maybe then we would receive the grace that Paul talked about that's made perfect in our weakness. Maybe then my anxiety would subside and I would actually be able to sleep and my health might improve. This is a piece of equipment right here. It's called a limiter. We have one on our sound system right now. Its job is to protect the components of the sound system and maybe more importantly, to protect your ears by limiting the noise level that can come through these speakers. So if there were to be a sudden loud boom or a squeak, or if I were to scream as loud as I can into this mic, this piece of equipment right here would actually limit the frequencies that would get to your ears. So my question for you today, what's the limiter in your life? What's filtering out the hurry and the busy and the stress and the anxiety? See, I think Jesus knew the human hurry limiter. I think he understood it, and in his mentoring, he tried to show us how to access it. Because your limiter is the silence and the solitude that Jesus was always chasing. So how are you doing? Would you receive the invitation of Jesus today? The invitation is, come follow me, but we know where he's going, right? He's going on the mountainside. He's going into the wilderness. He's going to the quiet place. Will you follow him there? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to practice for 2 minutes. And you just said, whew, only 2 minutes. It'll be hard. Isn't that crazy? 2 minutes of silence will be hard. No talking, no phones. I don't even want you looking around. Maybe, unless you're not comfortable, please don't let me push you into something you're not comfortable with, but maybe you would just close your eyes. I'm going to give you 1 minute to process one question, then I'm going to give you 1 minute to process the next. And we're just going to be quiet. No music, nothing. Would you close your eyes with me? I want you to think for 1 minute. What is one major limit that God has placed in your life? And how does God want to use that limit to show you his perfect grace? And now I want you to think, specifically and practically, how will you get away to the silent place this week? Mother Teresa ordered her fellow nuns to 3 one-hour blocks of silent prayer every day if they were to be effective with the poor. 3 hours. But the question for you is not 3 hours, but how will you find quiet silence this week?